Hello everybody, this is a hopefully short video about on-the-job learning and how that is assessed. This is for the SW4014 module of the BA Integrated Degree Apprenticeship Program. And hopefully this little video will be useful to both mentors and apprentices. Sorry for my little stutter there, but I'm probably going to stutter every so often and make a mistake in the video, but I'm not going back to the start and recording it unless I get it drastically wrong. So what will I talk about today? Let's just see if we can move on to the next slide. General overview of the program, what's involved over the next 3 years. Specific information about on-the-job learning, or at least an introduction to that. Focus on who was involved, what is the role of the mentor, and a little bit about professional standards. As with other things I will refer to in this recording, there will be a separate video on professional standards. There's too much detail to go into here, but just to give you a sense of what standards we use to help our assessment processes. There are things you can immediately do. At this stage, at the start of the program in September, October, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about those, and I'll follow up about the mentoring agreement. All will become clear, I hope, in the next video. There is, of course, no room for Q&A and live interaction because this is a recording, but you can, of course, contact the teaching staff and myself, Dermot Brady, on the job lead for the apprenticeship programs as a whole, and I'm happy generally to answer your questions. So here we go. So this is a kind of a little map of the course teaching and learning over the next 3 years. The light blue boxes are taught modules. That means they occur in the classroom. The apprentice has 1 day a week in the classroom or in guided or independent study. So throughout the whole year, not just the academic terms, the apprentice has that protected day. Don't think to be able to do the course otherwise, really, to be honest with you. But of course, for the other 3 or 4 days a week, depending if you're part-time or full-time, we have these dark blue boxes, which is about on-the-job learning. So the idea is really that on and off the job learning should complement each other throughout the program. I'm talking today about this blue box up here in the top right-hand corner. I'll say a little bit about what's required of the apprentices and how you can start making progress on that straight away. Now, the program's kind of a complex thing with many moving parts. There's even, as you might be aware, kind of new language. It's slightly different from practice placements and things that we might talk about, more traditional routes. So we have on the job and off the job as a typical example of that. And there are ways that we have been given guidance, and we also develop our own guidance with employers, with students, and with people with lived experience in developing the program. And that's an ongoing process. So there may be many questions you may have, but we have plenty of guidance to work things out and answer most of your questions. This slide is just an example of how do you distinguish between what is on and off the job learning. So this need not detain us too much. I'm just really putting it up there as an example of we need to hear from you and you need to hear from us. Collaborative learning is the best sort of learning. So please do get in touch if you're unsure about anything, and we'll try to do our best to answer any questions you might have. But in the kind of real world, as it were, away from modules, policies, procedures, and guidance, the collaboration involves people. And you can see the apprentice at the top of this little kind of chain, as it were, involved in direct work with human beings in our agencies, identifying and following up on learning opportunities, professional development, training in class, learning, reflection, group work, all sorts of different things that go on. The apprentices are central focus, really, in a sense. In every apprenticeship program, um, you're required, or employers are required, to provide a mentor. That's usually a more experienced member of staff, usually a qualified person, sometimes with practice education qualifications, but that isn't essential. So that person will guide and support the apprentice for as long as possible, sometimes throughout the program. Sometimes it doesn't quite work out like that. But they will provide some reflective supervision and, I guess, a sounding board more generally to support the apprentice as they make their way through the program. Sometimes the mentor is the line manager, but not always. So we've worked with employers, learners, people with lived experience to develop this program over the years, and we continue to do that. So we have to take into account the very many different ways social work is delivered across London. We work with at least 30 different employers. So we're always trying to write the program with sufficient flexibility to allow for all those different delivery models. So sometimes your mentor will be the line manager, and sometimes it will not. But either, how would I say, arrangement is fine. And in any event, because it's going to involve allocation of work and other organizational issues, the line manager is usually going to be involved in some way, shape, or form. University tutor, I will come on to a little bit because I'm going to say a little bit more about the roles of the mentor and the tutor. So I'll just kind of wait a moment until we come to those parts of the video. But people with lived experience have been involved in all aspects of the program, and that includes developing the curriculum, feeding back in the curriculum, directly teaching in sessions and in class, involved in some assessment activities. So all sorts of things. We have a very active PLE group at Kingston University. We've been working with them for many years. And of course, people with lived experience will give feedback to apprentices at various different points during the program. So I suppose we call it an integrated degree, and these are some of the elements of that integration. So in terms of our teaching model, really it's not all that complicated, but there's supposed to be interactions between what happens in the university and what happens in work. So in the university, sometimes quite reflective teaching sessions, but obviously we introduce theories, models, approaches, all sorts of things of that nature. And we kind of work on those in class. Apprentices take those things into the workplace, try out things, and bring their actual real world work back into the classroom. So this is one of the major advantages of the program, is that we are constantly working with real world examples, real world problems. If you know anything about adult learning theory, you don't have to, but problem-based learning is actually strongly indicated as being a very good thing to do. At this very early stage of the program, a lot of apprentices are saying things like, oh, so that's what you call that they already have considerable knowledge, experience, and skills. And they're coming back and saying, well, I am doing that, but I didn't know it was called that. So we have some quite interesting and lively discussions and debates in class. So what is this mentor person? Well, the mentor, as I said already, can be the line manager, but more frequently is a more experienced member of staff who's been allocated that role. The history of mentoring, it comes from the Greek. Ulysses, a legendary character, traveling around the Mediterranean. Funny enough, he thought the Mediterranean was the whole world. Really quite have a broad enough perspective on that, perhaps. But while he goes off and has adventures, he leaves his family, Penelope, spend a lot of her time weaving, and Telemachus, his son, behind. And he thought that Telemachus should have some elder man to look after him. And he appointed mentor in this role. So hence mentor comes from this guy's name. You know, it's a myth and a legend, but never mind. But mentor, it turns out, it's a terrible mentor. He's very bad at it. So the first mentor was rubbish and needs Athena, got her wisdom and war. You can see here in the top right, to sort them out and put them back on the right track. Now, you can find out more about that if you were interested. Probably only of limited interest to a few people, but in any event. But we can see here right at the start, this is kind of very Eurocentric, what you call a perspective on the world, other perspectives, global ideas are kind of available. This is a little image from West Africa, kind of describes in a slightly different way, perhaps than we're used to, about the idea of reflection, that it is no shame to go back and take a seed from the past into the future and use it as a way to grow and develop. That's roughly speaking kind of my translation of what is actually probably a much more complex idea. But we are working in a global context, and perhaps we need to widen our horizons on occasion and think beyond business as usual. And certainly, I have to tell you, students bring a whole range of diverse perspectives, which are most welcome in our classes. So mentors are available globally, but in the kind of Eurocentric sort of view, we have some research and literature about mentors, and it's this idea that a mentor communicates interest and care for the well-being and development of another. So that's a fairly basic principle, but it also shows that it's not just about ticking boxes and kind of saying, have you met the standard? There's something a little deeper going on there in that working relationship. So it is something that is probably very worthwhile investing time and effort in. And in later slides, we'll make some suggestions about how you might do that. You will also notice that there is a person called the university tutor. Now, all students at Kingston are supposed to have a tutor, and indeed all students in most universities. But for our program, that person is going to be an experienced social worker. They're almost invariably practice educators and sometimes practice assessors also. And they are mostly, but not always, lecturers at Kingston University. So these are very experienced social work professionals, and they have particular experience in teaching and learning and supporting students and apprentices. They are responsible for the overall assessment of on-the-job learning. Now, there are some complexities about has a student passed a placement and things of that nature. And in more traditional practice education models, the practice educator in the workplace is usually responsible for that particular role or task. In our model, the practice educator role is actually split between the mentor and the university tutor. So it's collaborative, but the final sign-off has a person passed the placement. It's a judgment that has to be made in collaboration, of course, by the university tutor or member of staff, member of teaching staff at Kingston. The tutor is also a wider point of contact. There's lots of support services, for example, and other things that that tutor may kind of help refer into as appropriate. So at the start of the course, right now, there are things that you can do. And the first is connect and get to know each other, kind of meet up online, meaning, of course, the apprentice, the mentor, and the tutor. Start getting to know each other, invest, as I said, in that learning relationship. There is a thing called the first tripartite agreement. We'll get to know more about those, but that's a monitoring process that happens throughout the program. You do 3 of those a year. I'm certainly not going to talk about that here, but generally the university tutor will talk you through that process. So those first meetings will have elements of bureaucratic monitoring and administration in them, but also of relationship building. So you can also start to think about and plan for the learning for the coming year. And to do that, we use a mentoring agreement. And you'll see as we go on what's involved in that mentoring agreement. And in particular, I'm going to look at the early stages of that process and what might you do to make that a success in the coming year. Now, I would say a little bit about professional standards. Also, that I will provide a separate video about these because they are quite complex and detailed. But again, they're not something that you need to learn off by heart. You couldn't possibly do that. Well, I suppose you might, but I wouldn't advise it. So this is the Skills England apprenticeship standards for social work. Um, all apprenticeships have Skills England standards of one sort or another. They're quite detailed and lengthy. There's a little link there if you wanted to have a look at them. But for our first semester, that's the kind of period between September to December in the first year, we don't really focus so much on the Skills England standards, even though you will start to become aware of them through tripartites and other things. But let's not worry too much about that at the moment, other than to know that these standards govern apprenticeship programs, and we will need to become more familiar with them as we advance. Social Work England, of course, is the professional regulator, but only for qualified social workers. So they don't actually regulate students, but they do require us to ensure that students are familiar with the standards in their final year of the course or by the end of their period of study. Social Work England also determine education and training standards. So they tell us in the university about how courses should be governed, about what curriculum might look like and things like that. So even though that will be more in the background for most people, it certainly is in the foreground for the teaching staff and for the university department. In the first year, we particularly start off with Baswell's PCF. There are many advantages to the PCF. One, of course, being that people are generally quite familiar with it. But I think most importantly, it has levels of progression from entry to the course to readiness for practice, obviously then much later on to strategic level social work practice. Each of those standards has different nuance and emphasis, and they build over time, which means it's quite helpful for us in developing what standards are appropriate for what stage of the course. In the first year, it will be the readiness for practice standards. If you have a look at those, you will see that they're fairly basic, really, certainly as the person to qualified social work status. And generally, the apprentices are already able on their first day on the course to meet these standards. There are some things that they will need to work on, and of course, they have to provide evidence that they can meet the standards. And as we go along in the first semester, we will show you how we build that evidence base in the form of a portfolio. So what do we think about learning in any event? So the apprentices in some ways are novices, but also they have significant expertise, knowledge and skills. Some people have been working in services for decades, and they have learned a thing or two. They know about the law, they know about how agencies function, about perhaps what different parts of the process might be, and in particular, they have relationship skills. Have learned how to engage with and work with people who are sometimes in extremely difficult circumstances, how to motivate people perhaps, and how to assist people in the process of making change. So while it may not always be a linear progression, in some domains, as it were, in some aspects of our learning, it may be, okay, we can map out where we need to go here. But we also know the process of change is kind of more a spiral. It's the kind of thing we kind of go forward and backwards, and that it's not really straightforward or linear. And it involves quite a bit of personal change and reflection. This is a very well-known model, the trans-theoretical model of change by Prochaska and Di Clemente. But it kind of indicates that as we are making that process of change, and learning is change, that there's kind of psychologically different states as we go. We don't learn anything. We don't think we have anything to learn. So pre-contemplation might not be all that helpful, might be difficult. But once we're in the mode of contemplation, thinking about, I need to know more, I want to progress my career, I want to professionalize my work and get that degree certificate. We then very quickly move into preparation and action. We're at that stage at the moment. In actual fact, if you looked at this model from afar, you might kind of think, okay, all the circles are kind of equal size, but that's not the real world, is it? Because the contemplation and thinking about it and preparing and getting yourself ready might actually be a much bigger circle than the others. Because once you've made that commitment and you've started the journey, away you go. There is maintenance, of course, and relapse that every so often, well, I am just too tired to study today and I never want to see another assignment in the rest of my whole life. Then we have to pick ourselves back up again. So learners, and indeed teachers, I suppose, need that support and motivation from other people around them in order to progress and achieve what we have no doubt all our apprentices can achieve. But even in that moment at the start of the course, people start off perhaps with high levels of motivation. And really, you don't kind of know what you're getting yourself in for because you've kind of uninformed ideas. And then you very quickly get informed by being in the class. In the first few weeks, um, it is quite confusing and anxiety provoking for a lot of people because you're kind of faced with all this new information, not to mention all the IT systems and all these things that are going on. But there is also the great joy of meeting your peers, of people that you have not met before who are working in other areas of practice. And you can see people actually making friends, would you believe? So it's a beautiful process, but it's also quite demanding and kind of can be a shock to the system. But people generally pick up and gather themselves together and move on forward. We have, of course, a whole series of documents and briefings and outlines of what you're going to do during the year. These couple of slides, which I am not going to go through, um, to kind of show what various things are required at various different points. And as the year progresses, of course, there'll be more of this assignment guidance, that kind of thing. But today, really, the focus is starting the mentoring agreement. Now you kind of think, well, what is an agreement? An agreement essentially is a form of contract, an agreement between two people that they will do something for each other and that they will work in a collaborative way to achieve that. So there is a template for the mentoring agreement. It is the apprentice's responsibility to download that template and then bring it to the mentor, and the two people can then kind of work together on it with a little bit of guidance and support from the university tutor. It could be a dreadfully tick box exercise, but that generally is not working in social work because the relational aspect is always going to be important, and it is no less important in the teaching and learning relationship than it is in the relationship we might have with families and adults and vulnerable people that we might be working with. So we've suggested a couple of models, but bear in mind, of course, that this is all process rather than event, that the learning develops over time and so will the learning relationship. In the early stages, you're kind of getting the nuts and bolts kind of structure of what we need, learning about that and how things are done. Then you kind of maintain a focus over time, but you will increasingly have more independent learners. Apprentices become more independent and self-directive. Of course, some start off very much like that. But in the initial stages, there's quite a lot of direction and guidance. It doesn't take too long for people to get their heads around that. But again, I'm just really saying that it is process. We get more sophisticated about these things as we go on. So the template looks something like this, and you can see at the start of it's just basic details, names, dresses, etc., etc., so we can contact each other. There is just one document that will follow a person through the whole of the year. So you don't start off a new document for the review or anything like that. Now, I'm not going to talk about reviews today, but you basically do initial agreement, one review, usually at the start of the second term, and then a final review towards the end of the year. Time enough for that. But surprise, surprise, you do a review. The next section is all about the mentoring roles and responsibilities, the different people involved. I'd advise you to spend a little bit of time having a look at this. I don't think it's rocket science. There's anything really kind of surprising here in this document, but it's worth just spending a bit of time reading through that with all concern. Now, here's the bit where we can start doing that investment in the relationship. So you can see it is getting to know and understand each other. Now, admittedly, at times, your mentor might be somebody who knows the apprentice quite well. They've been in the team together for quite some time and actually have co-worked, etc., etc. But in every event, I would ask you just to kind of sit down and work on this particular working relationship that you're going to have, because we're into a kind of a new mode of collaboration and co-working. It says, describe any tools you have used for this conversation and what you learned about each other and how you can use that in a positive way in your relationship. So what kind of tools might you use? So we're obviously going to be continually reviewing this process and get to know each other a little bit as we go. And a tool that is commonly used these days, and commonly used because it's very effective and it seems to work very well for people, is the social graces model. Now, this comes from family therapy initially, in particular supervision in family therapy. And we will send the article out for you. It is free access, so you don't have to pay for it. Um, yeah, so available to everybody, basically. And there's a little template here, which is that diagram on the left-hand side of this slide. That kind of shows you the kind of things that you might talk about. Now, it's unlikely that you'll be able to talk about all of these. So it may be that mentors and apprentices kind of make a choice or a decision. And of course, there are decisions to be made about how much you might share, what you might keep to yourself, and so on. There's a couple of questions here that might kind of guide that process. I advise you to read the article because it is very interesting. And as I say, it's become very popular in social work and perhaps very useful for that very reason. In any kind of relationship between two people, between groups, not everything is on the table. Some things are visible, some things are voiced, and some things are not. As you can say, there may be various permutations or combinations of what is visible and voiced. So there's some interesting choices and decisions to be made there about what people may feel comfortable in disclosing and talking about. And of course, that's entirely up to them. This isn't an exercise in forced disclosure, if you see what I mean. And we have to respect people's choices. But we kind of find that quite often people are talking about things that are not really contentious, but are not known to the other person. So the process of getting to know each other can be quite a revelation at times. It's not the only model. There are plenty of others. And in fact, there's lots of reflective models that we kind of introduce throughout the course. But here's a particular one that came from a particular need. So this is from a social work academic and practitioner called Prosper Teedham, very well-known writer. She's written extensively on practice education in particular. And she noticed in her practice that Black African students were a significant cohort entering the profession. I think that's something that's generally acknowledged and known. Certainly it is in Kingston. So she noted tools for building relationship are important, but there were kind of bits missing in some of the tools, and in particular, talking to a lot of Black African students about their direct experience in the workplace, that there were some issues that needed to be addressed perhaps in a different way. She noticed that some of the students were, well, in fact, as a group, were more likely to fail placements, and she was going, well, what is happening here? This cannot be an issue about the competence, the ability, or the capability of the student. So there must be perhaps something wrong with the way we are doing things. So the best way forward, of course, is to ask and explore and research. Spray is a researcher, after all. And she said students are more likely to fail placements and they experienced homesickness. That's a very particular thing. Anybody who's ever experienced it will know how powerful a feeling that is. And perhaps how debilitating it might be on occasion. Nipped wings was quite important because it may be kind of given an indication to us that students had excelled or done very well in other aspects of education, were highly committed to education. But in this particular context, that just did not seem to be happening. So that obviously came with its own frustrations and difficulties. And part of the issue was a lack of practice experience. So a lack of experience in the workplace, which is perhaps less of an issue for our students, but it may well have been an issue at the start of their practice. I don't know. But nonetheless, this model seems to be very effective because people are telling us about how they use it on the apprenticeship program. And of course, financial constraints, very difficult to kind of earn, learn, and particularly when you're also perhaps having caring responsibilities. There's a lot to juggle, and as we well know, life's not getting any cheaper, is that? That particular experience of thinking that practice learning felt like another world was really, really important. So it was kind of alien environment, difficult to navigate and negotiate. So she developed a tool. She called it the Mandela model because it's an acronym of the kind of stages in the process. And I often think that one of the most important things here is simply to make time. That if you notice that there is something not quite working out here, that we need to invest time in that to kind of do that exploration and reflection to kind of fully understand what's going on. Do the other person the honor of investing in that kind of working relationships. There are, of course, maybe many other tools, and we'll send you out both of those things. Siobhan McLean's share model, for example, has become very popular in recent years, and that might be a structure that works better for some people. And it may be as we go forward that, how would I say, we develop new tools within the apprenticeship. You never know, we might get creative all of a sudden. And not all the available tools will work well with all the available people, will they? So perhaps there's an imperative on our part as educators, learners, and so on to actually think about new and better ways of doing things. After that section, there's a bit about apprentices' strengths. So the apprentices, as I said earlier, come with a lot of skills, knowledge, experience, so they know a thing or two. And then we should list what those things are. We should think as widely as possible about that list of skills and experience. Sometimes people are a little bit modest, shall we say, about their skills and experience and kind of think, oh, shucks. But really, what we're doing here is a professional self-assessment. There's other parts of the program that also do things like that. There's a thing called the Navigate program, part of the Future Skills program. But for our purpose here, this is something that the apprentice and the mentor will work out. And in fact, by the time they do that, they may have the results of the initial Navigate sessions. And that actually might be very useful here. From that point, we can then move on to what the learning needs and opportunities to meet those needs might be. But in this instance, we're starting off with the strengths. So we think about the possible areas to find strengths. So there's probably several layers of this. Some of it will be about students' personal strengths, their perseverance, their determination, their patience, so on and so forth. Some of it will be about skills, the ability to actively listen, their ability to engage with people who might be not feeling like talking to a social worker today, so on and so forth. They may be able to present in public. They may have been involved in training. All sorts of professional skills will be involved here, both interprofessional and other professional skills as well. And of course, there will be knowledge. The knowledge will be, I don't know, for example, knowledge of the Children Act 89 or the Care Act 2014 and how those are applied in practice and what sections cover reviews or safeguarding, whatever. There's a whole kind of series of professional knowledge that come into this as well. And perhaps some of the strength is in their circumstances, the support net they can draw on, support from team, from family, from perhaps organizations that they belong to, perhaps the role of faith in their practice, and the strength that they might draw from faith communities and other things of that nature. So once you've done that thoroughly, you're likely to be able to move on to the next sections. And there's a little bit here about suitability status verification and accessibility and support needs. Now, I'm not going to go into those rather in too much detail, because the next video will say a little bit more about that. But in actual fact, they're not contentious at all. The first one really is about have there been changes in circumstances at the start of your course that may affect your ability to continue with it. That might be a criminal conviction or involvement with social services, something of that nature. And accessibility and support needs is what it says. Are there reasonable adjustments that the employer or the university need to make to help the student or assist the student in their success? Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next video, and we will also talk about this. Once you have established the students learning what they already know and can do, then obviously we're going to kind of work on what do they need to develop further. And as I said, we'll give it that a little bit more specific time in the next video. Really, our focus will be what learning opportunities are available to you in work, and we'll cast our net widely. But you could start thinking about that already. And in fact, I'm sure many students are. So just to remember that throughout the year and across the 3 years, generally we'll have a process of the learning. Quite often it'll start off with shadowing, and then it will be doing with support and guidance and doing independently. And you'll see that happen both over the year and over the 3 years. So as we said, learning is a process, not an event. It's also something to be finely judged. In the comfort zone, we don't really learn anything. It's all very nice, but we're twiddling our thumbs and having a cup of tea. Nothing wrong with that. But we need to push the envelope out into the learning zone. Sometimes that would be uncomfortable. Sometimes that would be a joyous experience. All sorts of things happen there. But we try to avoid the panic zone. So if you overload learners with too much, too early, too quickly, nobody learns in the panic zone. So there needs to be a kind of conversation about what kind of pace we progress at, which will be quite individual and unique to each learner. There's a little bit of research and evidence about the experience of apprentices on social work courses. This is from Stone and Worsley. I think it actually ended up in print in 2022, but they were writing about their early experiences. Funny enough, they started at the same time as we did, right in the middle of the pandemic. Such fun. In any event, we'll introduce students to this article, and maybe they can chime with some of the experiences that the students here were describing. So as we know, things are a system. There are a whole series of modules to be completed. There are relationships to manage between the university and the employer, sometimes problems to be worked out. There are lots of different people involved. So it's a system of complex moving parts. But we seem to manage with communication, being transparent, to actually progress things on. And I have to say, apprentices do extremely well on our courses. I expect that to continue. Questions? Yes. Send me your questions on an email, please. But a lot of this you will work out with your university tutor, your mentor, your apprentice, kind of talking formally and informally together and kind of working out how things work and what is there to be learned. And as ever, with presentations of this nature, here's a few little references that I used, referencing, it's its own skill, but you will learn that as the course progresses. So I think that is quite enough for one day. Perhaps A little longer presentation than I'd hoped, but in the next session, we're going to talk about learning opportunities, how to identify these, and how to write them. So thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to interacting with you in all sorts of different ways, including virtually, over the coming years. And I hope you have a good day. See you later. Bye.